So we are recording.
Okay, this morning we have with us Dr. Fred Johnson and another session on last stands. Dr. Johnson is a professor at Hope College. He's also, prior to that, been in the United States Marine Corps as an infantry officer. He graduated from Bowie State College, now a university. He has his MA and his PhD from Kent State University. And his specialty is in U.S. history, military history, and African history with near and dear to us, a lot of sessions on Civil War history. So with that, Dr. Johnson.
Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you again for this last session of Last Stands. And this one is entitled, as you can see, Insurrecto. So let's go ahead and get at it, shall we? This pertains to an event that happened during the Spanish-American War, and it's something that, quite honestly, is not very much spoken of in American history. But as you'll see when we get to the end, there are some things about what was called the Philippine Insurrection or the Filipino-American War. It foreshadowed some events, some policies, some lessons that really should have been learned that might have saved us a lot of heartache and a lot of just anxiety and challenge in the middle of the 20th century relative to a place called Vietnam if we had just paid attention. You can't really take one historical event, especially separated by 50, 60 years, and just conveniently overlay them onto each other, but there were definitely some signs and patterns that could have given us some insight about what to do in Vietnam and what not to do in Vietnam if we had paid closer attention to what was happening during the Filipino-American War. The best way to start is to do a prelude, because the Spanish-American War occurred at a time, if you can use the example of the analogy of just like the time that we're living through right now. I honestly cannot tell you, and no one I don't think can tell you, how education is going to be after we get past all this coronavirus anxiety and challenge. But whatever education looks like in the future, it will not be exactly as it was. It can't be, because we have now discovered that we can actually teach more through computers. It's not the ideal way, but they're going to be a bigger part of everything we do. So the world that we're coming to know that's changing right now is being formed before our very eyes. The big question is, what is it going to be? Likewise, at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, the world was changing before people's eyes, and part of that world involved you might say that a major shift, a major departure point was, of course, the American Civil War. The American Civil War is responsible for so many things. It was the world's first modern war. It's what brought the United States out of basically its 18th century agrarian self into a more modern industrial self. As I mentioned, it's the world's first modern war. It took everything we understood about warfare, which is generally horrible, terrible, difficult, and made it even more horrible, difficult, and terrible, but in a modern industrial sense. It changed government, it changed the economy, it changed everything. And things just were never the same after the Civil War. One significant individual who was part of the Union government during the Civil War was this individual right here, William H. Seward. William Seward, born May 16, 1801 to October 10, 1872, was the Secretary of State through both administrations whether the Lincoln administration and also the Johnson administration, Andrew Johnson being the person that succeeded to the presidency after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. William Seward, before the war, was a very powerful New York politician. He and Abraham Lincoln did not see eye to eye. In fact, he at one time tried to stage what would have amounted to a coup in the cabinet, but Lincoln outmaneuvered him. And after that happened, and he was basically essentially put in his place, Seward and Lincoln they formed a very close partnership. And in part, it's one of the many kind of connections that Lincoln had with other members of his government that helped the northern government, the Union government, successfully prosecute the war. Clearly, the Civil War, as you can see from this map, was one in which the country was divided north-south, the Confederate States in the red. On April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire at Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. The Civil War was in every way, started out in the early months from Bull Run all the way to December 1861 into the spring of 1862. It was still your typical style Napoleonic 18th century war with cavalry charges and all of that. But as the war dragged on, every month of the war, it became more and more violent. And it wasn't until actually September 16th through 18th, or September 16th through 19th, 1862, at the Battle of Antietam, that the casualty figures in that one battle were so astonishingly high. Everybody, both North and South, had to agree that this particular conflict was different than any other conflict certainly fought in North America and possibly in the world. This is going to be a long, drawn out, costly, miserable affair. During the Civil War, the rest of the world wasn't just standing still, waiting for the Americans to finally work out through violence their differences between North and South over the issue of slavery. There were many other things, but the central driving cause that started the Civil War was slavery. During the Civil War, the Europeans were very busy moving into Africa. Now, I would have shown you a map about what Africa looked like beforehand, but to expedite time, if you take a look at this map of Africa, the thing to know about the continent of Africa is you consider the sweep and scale of this map, is that there have been computer simulations that show that the United States can fit, the entire country of the United States can very easily fit inside of the continent of Africa and still have a lot of room left over. So this is a tremendously large continent. And in the space of 15 years, from 1884 to 1900, the Europeans conquered the entire continent. But from 1850 until 1884, and that period, of course, would comprise the American Civil War, Europeans were moving into Africa, claiming territory for themselves, and in the process of claiming that territory, creating some hostilities or some anxieties and tensions inside the European continent. On April 9th, 1865, the American Civil War ended. Now keep in mind that while the Americans are fighting the Civil War and you go from Civil War to Reconstruction, the Europeans are still very much getting involved in Africa because for them, it's the second wave of colonization. It's the second European industrial revolution. They need resources and raw materials and minerals and resources from overseas, and Asia and Africa supply those resources. One of the things that happens during the Civil War is that Emperor of France, Napoleon III, because the Mexican government owed France a lot of money, it was very deeply in debt to the to the French. Emperor Napoleon III sent some people to Mexico to take over the government, and William Seward, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, protested against this maneuver because of the Monroe Doctrine. Basically, the Monroe Doctrine, released in 1820, the President James Monroe gets the credit for actually the doctrine. It was John Quincy Adams, his Secretary of State, who wrote the doctrine, but it basically put European powers on notice that all the nations and territories in the Western Hemisphere were off limits to further European colonization. Now, the United States, quite frankly, could not have backed up what they would have done if, in fact, European powers did try to colonize. And in fact, there were European powers that did violate that doctrine. But it did put the world on notice that the United States considered the Western Hemisphere to be that part of the globe that it will police diplomatically and, if necessary, militarily. Let's take a look at this. French troops moved into Mexico. The excuse was to collect debts from the bankrupt Mexican government. So in 1864, Napoleon III installed Archduke Maximilian of Austria as Emperor of Mexico in 1864. Before we get deeper into this, I want us to pay attention to the international power politics involved here. You got French troops from Europe moving into Central America, into Mexico. And so the person that the French are going to install in Mexico is a guy from Austria, right next to Germany, just south of the United States fighting a civil war. There's a whole lot of diplomatic maneuvering going on, and many, many things can go wrong when we have the Mexicans involved, the Austrians, the French, and the Americans, who, in addition to everything else, are in the middle of beating themselves into a stalemate or at least into a coma with the Civil War. Seward tries to limit that French infiltration by protesting. He can really do nothing else because obviously, as Secretary of State, he's dedicated to making sure that his government can put down the Southern Rebellion. There was a possibility after the Civil War of a US military intervention. Now, I got to tell you, if in fact the United States had decided to intervene and confront the French after the Civil War, it wouldn't have been one of those cases where the French would have overwhelmed us, because at the end of the Civil War, the United States had one of the largest armies on earth, and more than that, it had just spent 4 years fighting a brutal, bloody civil war where everything from the economy and the best of technology and the best of industry had been poured into the war effort. So the United States was no slouch military force after the Civil War. Like we had done throughout our history, what will quickly happen is that the US will demobilize, and the US, the Grand Army of the Republic, the future US Army, will go from 1 million men down to basically a frontier force for policing or chasing down Native Americans. But immediately in the aftermath of the Civil War, we were the equivalent or better than most European powers. Now in 1867, Napoleon III finally agreed to cooperate and withdrew French troops from Mexico. Another thing that happened on the world stage that we can attribute and give credit for to William Seward was his 1867 purchase of Alaska. He bought it from the Russians. They're probably still crying over that deal. But what it did was it gave the United States another outpost on the Pacific in addition to California. All this just to say that while the Europeans were moving deeper into Africa, while the Europeans were moving into Asia and establishing colonies in the second wave of colonization in response to the second wave of industrialization, the United States in this period was not standing completely idle as far as looking overseas and gaining some territories all by itself, or making sure that the hemisphere that it was part of was off limits to Europeans. Some other things that William Seward did was he expanded US commercial presence in Asia by increasing American influence over Hawaii by concluding a reciprocity treaty to bind that island's economy to the United States. So in other words, making sure that the Hawaiians, that their economy was brought into the American orbit, basically to make them dependent upon the mainland. Seward also attempted to purchase some suitable Caribbean naval bases. He attempted to ratify a treaty with the Colombian government allowing the United States to build an Isthmian canal. Today we call that canal the Panama Canal, but I think we need to remember that there was a time when to go from the East Coast to the West Coast, you would literally have to go down the entire, East Coast of North America and South America, and then go up the West Coast of South America and North America. It was an exceedingly long trip, and people had for decades just pondered and conjured if they could just cut a way through Colombia, that narrow part of Central America, then they could cut that trip by a greater deal of significance. And then also, in addition to all the other things he was doing, the focus of the Congress and the country on Reconstruction, undoing the damage of the Civil War, trying to literally rebuild the South and rebuild from the damage of the war, but to rebuild the culture and the economy of the South, and to basically try and smooth out whatever tensions remained from the Civil War. The Congress and the country was fully caught up in doing that. So there wasn't a whole lot of activity or interest in doing things overseas. That would change though. While America was busy fighting the Civil War and getting involved in Reconstruction, elsewhere around the world, and when I say elsewhere, what I mean is specifically in Europe. And by that, I mean specifically Germany. In the nation of Germany, the Germans came together, the Northern and Southern Confederation, they united into what became modern Germany in 1861, the first year of the American Civil War. And a person who quickly rose to prominence in Germany was a man named Bismarck, specifically Otto von Bismarck. He was called the Iron Chancellor. Otto von Bismarck, when it came to diplomacy and politics, he's what he invented, or they gave him, attributed to him, a word called realpolitik. He was a realist. He was a pragmatist. In fact, he was the ultimate pragmatist. When it came to foreign policy, when it came to international relations, Otto von Bismarck was the kind of person who had this worldview, this mindset. If he could achieve the goals of his nation diplomatically, he would do it that way. If he had to go to war to achieve those goals, he would do it that way. If he had to do a combination of war and diplomacy, he'd do it that way. But he was prepared as much to go to war as he was to go to the negotiating table to do whatever would work. The means always justify the ends for Otto von Bismarck, because his idea was to make Germany not just a dominant power, but a world power, but to also create an international system where Germany would be protected, given that it had vulnerabilities in Western Europe with the enemy of France, and also Eastern Europe, well, with other Eastern European nations and Russia to boot. What he did in 1884 as a sign which signaled to the international community Germany's not growing prominence, but its arrival on the world stage as a major power, and specifically a major colonizing power. Otto von Bismarck sent out a call to the other European nations, which were busy in Africa and Asia, scrambling to gobble up all this land. He sent out a call inviting them to a conference in Berlin that lasted from November 15, 1884 until February 26, 1885. The purpose was to manage Africa's colonization. Let me take a moment to explain what's going on here. This is very important, and quite frankly, it is a significant factor that eventually produces another cataclysm that will change the world that in ways that people can't imagine, that thing called World War I. By 1879, European activity on the African continent was so frenetic, it was so energetic, it was so haphazard, with European nations grabbing land here and grabbing land there. There was no set, orderly way of doing it, no international treaty. And in the process of gobbling up all this territory from Africa, for example, France might claim some territory that Britain thinks belongs to it. Now, when the French and the British start arguing about land in Africa, what that means is that hostility transfers to diplomatic difficulties inside of Europe proper. Now, I don't know any other way to put this, but the mindset of the time was something like this. Why would cultured, civilized Europeans go to war to fight over land populated by a bunch of savages? Which is how the Europeans, the colonizers, referred to Africans, and certainly how they saw them. So cultured, civilized Europeans can find a better way of doing this. Instead of fighting about it, why not sit down at the table, so Otto von Bismarck's thinking is, and just agree upon a plan, a protocol, so that if Britain is claiming land, then Britain has to do several things to legitimize this claim. Likewise for France, likewise for Germany, likewise for Belgium. In other words, any European power claiming land in Africa has to do certain things in order for other powers to honor the legitimacy of those claims. So as you can see here on the screen, the purpose was to manage Africa's colonization. Then it was to avoid armed conflict between rival colonial powers. One of the results was it internationalized two rivers, the Congo and the Niger River. The Niger River, Niger, going through the nation of Niger, is in West Africa, the Congo going more through Central Africa. And so the internationalization of those rivers, given that both of those are major riverine systems, means that it wouldn't make any sense for one nation to claim complete commerce and navigation. So all the Europeans agreed that the rivers belonged to anybody who was on them. And also Bismarck sought to initiate a new campaign to abolish the overland slave trade. Yes, in 1884, slave trafficking was still occurring in Africa. And also, it was to recognize Leopold of Belgium, the territory that he claimed, which was known as the Congo Free State. Now listen, colonization was generally a raw deal for the Africans. How could it not have been? It's just being conquered. And all the colonizers were to some extent, brutal in their methods, unfair to be sure, non-democratic. It was never designed to have democracy. But of all the colonizers, of all the horribleness that generally went along with colonization, the Belgians seemed to take a special pride in making sure that they were the most horrible of all the horrible. King Leopold was a monster. You can see here these pictures, these depictions showing Otto von Bismarck there. He was a big man, a tall man, dominating the room at the Berlin Conference. This is a more up-to-date map, a 21st century map, showing even today how rich Africa is in resources, gold, diamonds, uranium. Some of you may know that it was the uranium for the 2 atomic bombs that the United States dropped on Japan. That uranium came from the Congo. So this is still a very, very wealthy continent. And although American foreign policy has generally been pretty lousy in Africa, we should take heed, we should take notice of the fact that the Chinese over the last 30, 40 years, they've been very busy in investing in Africa. And believe it or not, even the North Koreans have been trying to establish good relations with African countries and leaders. This is a political cartoon showing Bismarck with other European leaders, you know, cutting up the pie or cutting up the cake of Africa. You know, it's very difficult sometimes for us to really understand or put ourselves in the shoes, in the mindset, in the skin of these people living alive back then, because I would hope that today people would say, who do you think you are, just to go into an entire continent and say, well, I'm gonna just take it over. But friends, that's exactly who these folk were. To them, it was open for the taking. The people who inhabited the continent didn't deserve it, or if they weren't going to be taken over, then they would have done something to either build themselves up into a better civilization, or more specifically, they would have been able to stop the Europeans from doing it. But there was a thing called social Darwinism that said those that have the power and who are meant to dominate do, and how do we know that? Because they are, and those who are meant to be dominated are dominated. How do we know that? Because, well, they're conquered. So social Darwinism was a very, very convenient and very, very insidious kind of philosophy that was operating in North America, in Europe, in many parts of the world during this period that justified the kind of colonization that took place. While that's going on, back in the United States, the Americans were not at all immune to the possibility to looking overseas. Now, as the dust settled and the smoke cleared from the Civil War, there were American policymakers and international strategists and military theorists who were looking at what was going on, what the Europeans were doing, and decided that America could not afford to not be part of what was going on when it came to extending itself overseas. One of the chief expositors of that viewpoint was a naval officer named Alfred Thayer Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan, in addition to Frederick Jackson Turner, the historian from the University of Wisconsin, Alfred Thayer Mahan, almost more than any other individual at the end of the 19th century, set the tone and the direction and the discussion and the atmosphere for what America would do overseas as we transition from the 18th, rather from the 19th to the 20th century. The impact that he had cannot be underestimated. Keep in mind, at the end of the 19th century, America is a maritime nation. We easily think of Great Britain as being a maritime nation because, after all, it's an island. But America's got an east coast of several thousand miles and a west coast of several thousand miles, plus some major interior river systems, the Tennessee, the Cumberland, the Ohio, the Mississippi, Snake River, the Colorado River. I mean, America, not to mention the 5 Great Lakes. So America is a nation that knows how to go to sea, that knows how to float, knows how to have a navy, and we had to have one with a big merchant fleet. And Alfred Thayer Mahan, as a senior naval officer, had some ideas about that. In 1890, he published his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. And in that book, Alfred Thayer Mahan said the following, among other things. He said that British control of the seas, combined with a corresponding decline in the naval strength of its major European rivals, paved the way for Great Britain's emergence as the world's dominant military, political, and economic power. Now, let's take a moment here. It would have been one thing if Alfred Thayer Mahan had said that Britain's dominance of the seas, and that's nothing surprising because after all, like I said, Britain Britain being an island nation is going to probably have a bigger navy, a more powerful navy, at least as powerful as any army is going to have. But it wasn't just that. It was the fact that Britain could dominate or control the seas. As Britain becomes a naval power, European powers are declining in naval strength. So that in combination with the fact, and so it doesn't, in addition to Britain becoming a military power, that rise in military power and ability to dominate at sea, it makes Britain a military power, but that military power also allows it to be an economic power and therefore a political power. So from Mahan's point of view, sea power is the key to military, economic, and political power. He went on to say those lessons could be applied to US foreign policy. In other words, what Britain did for itself in being a dominant naval and eventually military and political power, that same thing can happen for America, particularly in the quest to expand US markets overseas. And they say that the more things change, the more they stay the same. The one market that America had its eyes on, in addition to the Europeans, was China. We also, America had a representative in Berlin at the Berlin Conference, but we also had our eyes on China for the same reasons, well, for similar reasons today as back then as for today. A lot of people, a lot of opportunity to make a lot of money, a lot of customers. At the time, China had a very, very weak government, didn't even have a central government. So to put it bluntly, it was ripe for exploitation. Mahan also said in his book that the US economy would soon be unable to absorb the massive amounts of industrial and commercial goods being produced domestically, and argued that the United States should seek new markets abroad. The book comes out in 1890, which means it comes out 25 years after the Civil Wars ended. America is no longer a budding capitalist industrial power. America is an industrial, certainly an industrializing nation. And what Mahan is saying in 1890 is the pace of American growth in industry is going to eventually outpace the ability of the domestic economy to absorb all that production. America must establish a market overseas to sell those domestic products. To do that, we need to have a big Navy. He said, what concerned him most was ensuring that the US government could guarantee access to those new international markets. How do you do that in 1890? You got to have a big Navy, a big merchant marine to take those domestic products to those foreign markets, and a big Navy, a military Navy, to protect that merchant fleet. Now, the picture you see right here in the screen is from the Great White Fleet that Theodore Roosevelt sent around the world from 1907 to 1909. But what Mahan was talking about was a battleship Navy, not a cruiser Navy, not a destroyer Navy, but a battleship Navy. A Navy that could, even as they say at the Naval Academy, when I attended a foreign policy conference there as an undergrad, the one phrase I heard at that conference over and over for that whole weekend was the Navy was always concerned about projecting force abroad. The president has the ability to be in Washington, something happens in the Middle East, something happens around the Straits of Hormuz. What do? They traditionally dispatch an aircraft carrier battle group, sometimes just to show up and be there. Not to do anything, but just to let the folk in the neighborhood know we're here. And hopefully they get the message, because we're here means that we're here, and if we need to, we can launch these aircraft. And since most aircraft carriers have more firepower and destructive power on one single ship than all the bombs dropped during World War II, generally speaking, when an American aircraft carrier battle group shows up, people pay attention. Now, Mahan is saying that America's got to do something to guarantee those international markets, and doing so is going to require three things: a merchant Navy, to carry American products to new markets across the great highway of the high seas, and an American battleship Navy, and a network of naval bases let me go slow on that, a network of naval bases providing fuel and supplies. Don't forget, in the early 20th century, there's no nuclear powered vessels. These ships are being run by steam, coal powered fire plants. So they need what they call coaling stations. A ship can load up all the coal that it needs and go someplace else, an island, stop, refuel, get a new batch of coal, and continue on. You are not going to have a transoceanic, not a global naval fleet. You don't have places to stop to get refueling. Now, this is eventually what will happen. America is going to own Alaska, and of course, there's the west coast of the United States. But look at this network of naval bases that Alfred Thayer Mahan is talking about. What eventually happens for America is that we get the Philippines, Guam, Wake, Howland and Baker Island, Kingman Reef, Palmyra, Jarvis, Samoa, American Samoa. All those possessions are the kind that allow American vessels to go from Hawaii, whether from the West Coast to all these different areas, going as far as the Philippines and having the kind of capacity to be able to refuel and stay at sea. So these are just some more pictures of that Great White Fleet that was sent on a around the world trip by Theodore Roosevelt. It took them 2 years to do it, but they did it. This is the Great White Fleet leaving Seattle, Washington in May 1908. I don't know about you all, but the thing that fascinates me is that this is just over 100 years ago that we were there. America was doing this. America was flexing its muscles and announcing to the world. And of course, the appropriate person to do that announcement would have been Theodore Roosevelt, announcing to the world that America is not only just another power. These ships sent around the world were meant to send a message that America was not just intended to compete, but that America was a competitor to be taken seriously. It must have been impressive, to be sure. Now, Alfred Thayer Mahan writes his book in 1890. 8 years later, in 1898, the battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. There had been a pretty significant propaganda campaign going on in Cuba. And, we just don't have time for me to get into the details of the newspaper war between William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. But you all have heard of the phrase or the term yellow journalism. And today, people talk about fake news. Well, fake news is nothing new. It wasn't invented just in the last few years. The journalists of the New York World and the New York Herald, the papers owned respectively by Hearst and Pulitzer, they were competing for readership. Basically, these two newspapers were demanding more readers to make more money. And Frederick Remington, as I think I have a video clip to show you, Frederick Remington landed in Cuba. Cuba had been in the midst of a revolution for a number of years to try and get rid of Spanish rule. The Spanish were some pretty terrible colonizers as well. Spain was a weak nation. And Jose Marti had been leading the Cuban Revolution until he was assassinated. So the Spanish sent a general there named Valeriano Weyler to put down the rebellion. And this particular cartoon, or political cartoon, as you can see, the political cartoonists in the early 20th century, they were not subtle at all. They made the Spanish look like some type of a Neanderthal or caveman creature, and with blood from the knife and blood on his arms up to his elbows and so on. You can see here, this one showing the poor Cuban mother. Now listen, this one is not too far from the truth, because the Spanish, Valeriano Weyler was a cruel man. He did establish some concentration camps in Cuba where people were being starved to death, beaten to death, tortured to death. Now, what begins to happen inside the United States is that with Cuba being 90 miles off the coast of the United States, specifically Florida, you got a revolution going on where people are trying to fight to get rid of Spanish colonial rule. It did not take a whole lot of imagination at all for two newspaper editors or two newspaper owners who were trying to get more readership and make more money to spend that struggle into something that would have been called the Cuban version of the American Revolution. And who can't sympathize with the American Revolution? The idea of wanting to be free and getting rid of a colonial overlord who's trying to stop you from enjoying the rights and privileges and liberties of equal opportunity and freedom and everything that goes along with that, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the newspaper war irresponsibly took off, stirring up the American people, and basically Frederick Remington, who was in Cuba, dispatched to Cuba to get a firsthand look at what was going on. He sent messages back to the United States to say, you know, actually, there's not a whole lot going on over here. Yeah, there's a few things going wrong, but there's no great violent revolutionary upheaval. The message he got back was, look, we'll supply the pictures, and then we'll supply the war. And then it happened. When the Maine blew up, America went to war in Spain, and it was a pretty, frankly, shameful affair. America was a rising world power. The Spanish, they were long past their prime as a nation, especially as a colonizing nation. And they were very easily handled. Now let me show you a brief video on America's desires to help the Cubans.
America is opening up relations with Cuba, and it's a big deal, ending decades of hostility and beginning a new era between the two countries. But to understand just how big of a deal, where that hostility really came from, why it took so long to end, you've got to go back, way back. Not to the 1950s, as many Americans might think, but to the 1850s. The story starts with America divided between pro-slavery and anti-slavery politics, and one of their many fights is over the Spanish colony of Cuba. Pro-slavery lawmakers want to buy Cuba from Spain, or take it by force to turn it into a new slave state. Anti-slavery politicians oppose this, calling it imperialism. But fast forward to 1898, after slavery's over. Americans have a different version of this same argument when Cubans rise up against Spain. The US joins them, starting the Spanish-American War. But Americans divide. Should the US seize Cuba? This is part of a much bigger debate at the time over whether the US should explicitly become a European-style imperial power. So this is an argument about Cuba, but it's also an argument about America, what kind of country it should be. Should America be the kind of country that controls Cuba, or that respects it as a fellow sovereign nation? And that argument has continued in different forms ever since.
What that video clip brought to our attention, and again, this is kind of like, it's a really kind of creepy foreshadowing of a debate that will be had from 1965 until we get out of Vietnam. What kind of nation did America want to be? There was a very, very significant debate inside the United States during this period about why are we even looking to go, why are we looking to emulate the Europeans who, after all, they're going overseas to other countries and conquering and colonizing other people? Do we want to be like that? And there were people like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie who were opposed to this imperialist or expansionist impulse. So it wasn't that everybody was on board with this, and clearly people like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, his wealth in today's standards would have made him a multi-billionaire. So these are prominent people. Mark Twain, a prominent social critic. Andrew Carnegie, a prominent man of industry, a captain of industry. There were others with them who just did not either understand why, could not see the benefit we would get from it, who foresaw it causing a bunch of problems, and just saw it as being a very unwise foreign policy activity. And what it would do, it would put the Americans in competition with the Europeans. And at that point, people were still very much aware of the warning, that famous part of George Washington's farewell address. They were not looking to get involved in European affairs. And so people were very, very skeptical about doing things internationally that might cause them to end up in European entanglements. they clearly did not win that argument. Now, the Spanish-American War did not last all that long. And as you can see, peace treaty is ratified, awful slaughter. If you read down further, our troops in Manila killed the Filipinos by the thousands, 40 Americans killed. One result of the Spanish-American War was that, yeah, we do beat up on the, we beat up on the Spanish, we get a bunch of territories, and one of those territories is the Philippines. You see, the Filipinos all this time have been under the impression that with the United States going to war against Spain, that once we beat Spain up or got rid of Spain, that the Filipinos would be allowed to be an independent nation. Well, let's see what happened with that. First, a little bit of background on the Philippines. I have a definite soft spot for the Philippines because, as I think I've shared with you all before, I spent the first half of my childhood in the Philippines because my father was 20 years Air Force stationed at Clark Air Force Base on the main island of Luzon. I have been to Manila, right here. I have been to Cabanatuan. I have been to Baguio City in the Highlands. The Philippines remains today a beautiful country from what I've been able to gather, and it certainly was a great place to grow up as a child. The Philippines was a Spanish colony from 1571 until 1898. So basically, well over 350 years, the Philippines was a colony of Spain. And that ended because of the US war with Cuba and US involvement with the Filipino guerrillas in fighting against the Spanish. The Philippine Islands comprise 7,107 islands, some of which still have not been fully explored. It's located near Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim nation, Malaysia, Palau, and Taiwan. Taiwan should gather our attention because, after all, in America's relationship with Hong Kong, Taiwan, and mainland China, the Chinese have a one China policy, which makes things very, very, shall we say, delicate when you're having diplomatic relations with Taiwan, which calls itself China, and then mainland China. Manila, the capital, is right around 7,000 miles from San Francisco. Luzon and Mindanao are the two largest islands in the Philippine archipelago. There's 170 dialects spoken in the archipelago. The main one is called Tagalog. When I actually got to the United States, when my father was transferred to Andrews Air Force Base, I was pretty much fluent in Tagalog. Can't speak a lick of it now. And believe it or not, there's also a significant portion of the Philippines we have a Muslim influence. But we should not be surprised by that, because after all, the Philippines is near Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim nation on earth. So if you have an island nation nearby, I don't know how, but I'm thinking that it's not too much of a stretch of the imagination that people from somewhere migrated from there to the Philippines and brought their faith with them. And in 1898, the population of the Philippines was approximately 9 million. Now, the end of July 1898 in the Philippines, there were approximately 13,000 US volunteers and 2,000 regulars to take control of the Philippine Islands. To understand that, you need to understand that the modern force we understand today as the US Army, it was going to become that one day, but usually when America went to war, but especially before World War I, and even in the aftermath of World War I, it's not going to be really until World War II that the animal that we know, US Army, becomes this regular standing force. America always had a very, very, let's say, somewhat tenuous relationship with its military. The reason why we have a civilian commander-in-chief was because the founding fathers did not want somebody in uniform getting designs on taking over the country. They didn't want any kind of authoritarian, militaristic, totalitarian rulers. So you have a civilian commander-in-chief, so that when wartime comes, you call the military into existence. When war's over, you disband them. So there were volunteers that went to the Spanish-American War. After the war, though, there were volunteers who were regulars and 2,000 regulars who took over control of the islands. The Filipinos wanted independence. The Americans had another idea in mind. The Americans wanted the Philippines as a territory. Now, talk about some some diplomatic gymnastics, the Spanish governor in the Philippines was desperate. He was losing the war, but he needed to show that he had tried to at least fight to maintain the possession of the island. He was going to lose. He knew this. But his fear was that if he did not put up a good show of resistance, when he got back to Spain, he would be court-martialed and punished. So what he did was he cut a secret deal, which basically says, listen, American commanders, I'll pretend to fight, and you'll pretend to beat me up, and then I'll look good, and I can go back and tell my bosses in Spain, hey, I tried, but they overwhelmed us. That way, I don't get court-martialed, I don't get shot, you get what you want, and also, by the way, keep the Filipinos away, because we've been so horrible to them that they might massacre us the way that we've been massacring them. The Americans gave him a thumbs up, good deal, and the die was cast. On August 13th, 1898, there was a short battle with 17 US soldiers were killed, 105 wounded, and then the Americans occupied Manila and excluded the Filipinos. The Filipino capital was occupied, and the Filipinos who had been fighting were not included. Now, President McKinley issued something called, let me just go through this. By December that year, the relationship between the nationalists who have been fighting the Spanish, they've been allied with the Americans, but by December that year, their relationship was breaking down. So President McKinley issued the following statement. Bear with me, please, as I read. The destruction of the Spanish fleet in the harbor of Manila by the United States Naval Squadron commanded by Rear Admiral Dewey, followed by the reduction of the city and the surrender of the Spanish forces, practically affected the conquest of the Philippine Islands and the suspension of the Spanish sovereignty therein. With the signature of the Treaty of Peace between the U.S. and Spain by their respective plenipotentiaries at Paris on the 10th instant, and as a result of the victories of American arms, the future control, disposition, and government of the Philippine Islands are ceded, that is given, to the United States. To fulfill the rights of sovereignty, and that's being done, the Philippine Islands are being given to the United States to fulfill the rights of sovereignty and the responsible obligations of government thus assumed. The actual occupation and administration of the entire group of the Philippine Islands becomes immediately necessary. So Spain's giving us these islands, we must establish immediate control, and the military government heretofore maintained by the US in the city, harbor, and bay of Manila will be extended to the whole of the entire country. Military rule throughout the entire Filipino archipelago. In doing this, the US military and the commander of their military will make known to the Filipinos that the authority of the US will secure the persons and property of the people of the islands, and it will be the duty of the commander of the forces of occupation to announce that we come not as invaders or conquerors, but as friends. I'll leave it to your imagination to figure out how the Filipinos must have responded to that message. All persons who either by active aid or by honest submission cooperate with the government of the United States will receive the reward of its support and protection. Translation, play ball, you get rewarded. Don't play ball, we gotta do what we gotta do. Now look, let me just continue on here. This is what was known as McKinley's policy of benevolent assimilation. Benevolent assimilation. Now, the definition of that in the understanding of 1898, benevolent assimilation was as follows. The assimilation of a people group by absorbing foreign people into a new culture with the primary stated reason being that it is an act of benevolence. In other words, we are absorbing you into our culture because we have determined that it's the best thing for you. It'll be good for you. It sounds very similar to the positive good argument that was given by slaveholders. Listen, Black people, we know that slavery may not be a very convenient thing, but we're doing this for your own good because you can't take care of yourself. Nobody wants you here. You're going to get in trouble, and life will be harder for you being free than it would be being a slave. So if you think about it, we're actually doing you a favor. All right. I trust that the image communicates the response. And likewise, you can see here this political cartoon that occurred in the Chicago Recon, November 28, 1899. Benevolent assimilation, McKinley about to give a good thrashing to the confused Filipino there. The Treaty of Paris, signed between the United States and Spain, said that the Philippines was a territory of the US. Now, once the Spanish and the Americans signed it, in order for it to be really effective and binding, the Senate of the United States had to ratify it. But while they were doing that, the Filipinos, realizing that all their dreams for an independent state was not going to happen, the Filipinos finally figured out that the Americans were not arriving and certainly did not intend to let them be an independent nation. So they moved to establish a republic. And they also began preparing to resist US attempts to take over the Philippine Islands. Needless to say, relations between the two groups, the Americans and the Filipinos, got worse, deteriorated, and on February 4th, 1899, the last stand, the insurrecto, the Filipino insurrection, the American-Philippine War began on that date when Filipino and American patrols exchanged fire near a disputed village. To this day, no one knows who fired their first shot, but whoever it was, the Philippine-American War had started. The Filipinos wanted independence. In fact, most of the sources that I consulted for putting this program together refer to the Filipinos as nationalists, not driven by ideology. They're driven by wanting to have an independent nation. Congress, when hostilities started, a vote was taken in Congress that authorized volunteers being assembled to be sent to the Philippines. In September 1899, US forces began to arrive. Those US units did much to destroy and scatter much of the nationalist army, and so, not able to stand up against the Americans using conventional warfare, the nationalists, the Filipinos, they began resorting to guerrilla warfare. I'm hoping that you all are seeing some foreshadowing, just some disturbing foreshadowing developments that, again, if policymakers had paid attention to what happened in the Philippines, there's no telling whether or not it would have prevented things from happening, but it would have given us more insight. I just have to believe that. The guerrillas had on their side, they knew the terrain, rice paddies, mountains, and jungles. If you've never been to the Philippines, yes, I got to tell you, they have more than just a few highlands, rough trails, primitive roads. So the Filipinos, much like the Americans during the American Revolution, they waged war by ambushing, raids, and surprise attacks. By disguising themselves as non-combatants, in other words, blending in with the civilian population. Is this beginning to sound familiar? So they employed what they call a variety of charity and terror. On the one hand, they'll be nice to people. On the other hand, those who were seen as collaborators, if they were people who were suspected of disloyalty, would be handled in the most egregious or cruel way. The overall goal was to achieve political, military victory by sapping the American will to fight. Again, does this sound familiar? The Filipinos are not looking to win the war militarily. What they're looking to do is to fight as long as it's necessary to exhaust the will of the American people.
The president had hoped the Filipinos would willingly become part of the new American empire. To die for the right to govern themselves. For years, they had fought the Spanish. Now they were prepared to fight the Americans, if they had to. In January 1899, they established the Philippine Republic. 1900, Americans were fighting a guerrilla war 7,000 miles from home.
For the United States to maintain this empire, what the United States had to do was to use force and to project that force across thousands and thousands of miles. We had never done that. And we were now involved in civilizations, such as the Philippines, with which we had very little acquaintance. And there was a question whether or not Americans were really that good an imperialist in order to pull this off. This was an extremely brutal war that the United States and the Filipinos fought. Americans looked down on the Filipinos as people who were uncivilized. The term gook originated in the Philippine insurrection. We looked at this as essentially a superior power fighting an inferior people who deserved their inferiority because they had not been able to organize their society. They had not been able to uplift themselves, as McKinley liked to say. The United States was willing to use very brutal force in order to bring the Filipinos around. One soldier's letter, for example, relates how one of his comrades, an American soldier, had been found murdered outside this village with his stomach slit open. And the American commander immediately orders that everyone in this Filipino village be executed. And according to this young man who wrote home, there were 1,000 men, women, and children who were executed in this reprisal for the murder of this one American soldier. This was a no-holds-barred war between the Filipinos and the Americans. And by 1900, many Americans are beginning to wonder whether even all of the possible profits that this empire might offer were worth this kind of brutality.
As more and more American boys lost their lives, anti-war sentiment was growing. Many saw the war against a people seeking independence as a monstrous perversion of American ideals. Multi-millionaire industrialist Andrew Carnegie, a leader of a small but important anti-imperialist movement, asked, "Is it possible that the American Republic is to be the suppressor of the Philippine struggle for independence?" Carnegie offered to buy the Philippines for $20 million and set the island nation free. All through the winter of 1900, Americans read of devastation and horror half a globe away. Time and again, they were assured that the war was all but over. Native spies reported that thousands of Philippine insurgents were plotting to rise up against American forces in Manila. That a stash of bombs and munitions were hidden in a house in the center of that city. That rebels were massing in the provinces. McKinley had been told by his generals that they could subdue their barefoot opponents with 20,000 men. And the generals asked the president for 20,000 more. But 40,000 soldiers were not enough. By 1900, 60,000 American troops were on the ground in the Philippines. And the War Department was calling for another 2 divisions. McKinley knew that his chances in the November election could hinge on a war he didn't want to fight and didn't know how to win.
I don't know how you all are interpreting this, but that video clip to me has so many overtones. It could, if you had taken the word Philippines out of it and put Vietnam in there, you might have been talking about the same kind of conditions, except for the numbers of troops. So essentially, kind of sounds familiar, right? You're talking about the Philippines. Again, it sounds very similar to a later conflict where you have American forces thousands of miles away from home, fighting a war that people become increasingly disenchanted with and begin asking the question, is this really worth it? The generals telling them that they have one set of numbers that we can use this much, but then begin to ask for more and more troops, and an American president who was confident at first they could win the war, but then begins having doubts themselves, and then politics getting involved. It is just too many points of similarity. Well, let's move on. And you can see from the political cartoons. Look at how the cartoonists depict the Filipino people. They're shown as being very primitive, having a bone in their nose, grass skirts, barefoot. And folk, this is not 1800. This is now 1900. We are now either at the threshold of or crossing into the 20th century, which means that merely just barely 100 years ago, this was the viewpoint of major policymakers, military leaders and politicians, and social leaders about a foreign people. And just as the narrator said, the term that was used in Vietnam, gook, was first used in the Philippines. You see here in this depiction, Cuba, an American possession, is explained to the Filipinos, basically why they should be happy of getting some of that good American independence. This shows the Filipino leader, the revolutionary leader named Emilio Aguinaldo, who the picture is depicting as trying to establish a dictatorship, and the American fist beating him down again, benevolent assimilation. I should tell you all also that the gentleman that you all saw talking in that video clip was a man named Walter Lefebvre. Walter Lefebvre taught for many, many years, I believe, at UCLA. He was one of the top foreign policy historians in the country. And this cartoon right here depicting the progress of the United States as a nation in its infancy as a revolutionary nation. The Union started with 13 states, area and square miles, then 1803, then 1819 here, then 1861, the year of the Civil War starts, then 1898. America puts on a lot of weight in 1898 because of all the territories that it gains, and now in 1899, America's overweight. Now it has Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. So we were involved in the Philippine insurrection. Now, different people call that conflict different things. The Philippine insurrection, I think, has been used most often, but it's probably better, more accurate to call it the Philippine-American War, because from the Filipino point of view, it's not an insurrection. They were fighting for independence. That's what they thought they were going to get when they defeated the Spanish. But what they did was they traded one overlord for another. The US divided their troops in the Philippines and manned hundreds of small posts in or near towns that served three purposes. These outposts were there to protect the population from guerrillas, interfere with the ability of the population to provide food and recruits to guerrillas, and provide bases to conduct patrols and raids against those same guerrillas. Now, initially, dividing up American forces, it has some negative consequences for American forces. It caused a problem with supply, efficiency of supply. There was a morale problem, morale sunk, and some significant problems with command and control. or what today they call C3I, Command, Control, Communications, Intelligence. Disease and fatigue undermine the small garrisons. So you take your forces, divide them up into small forces, and we also need to remember this is still a time when yellow fever, dysentery, and especially malaria have not been conquered. In fact, it is because of the American occupation in Cuba where there'll be tremendous strides taken to eventually find a cure, or at least a way for defeating malaria, but definitely yellow fever. So disease was taking a toll on American forces, bad morale, bad supply, bad command control. But even with all that going against them, the Americans were able to keep the Filipino guerrillas on the run. And those Filipinos were steadily losing their will to fight and being worn down in their ability to fight. The last stand for the independence of the Philippines was coming to a close. President McKinley commented during this phase, "We need to win the confidence, respect, and admiration of the inhabitants of the Philippines." In a later period, other American presidents would say, "We need to win their hearts and minds." It's basically what McKinley's talking about. While the Americans were wearing down the guerrillas, they were also pursuing other priorities. One, to restore civil society by building schools and roads, refurbishing markets, improving health and sanitation. The Winning the Hearts and Minds program in Vietnam also involved similar things, providing medical assistance, building roads, building schools. In other words, doing the kind of things that people need to function in a society. American officials went so far to offer amnesty to the guerrillas. In other words, look, all we forgiven, just come in out of the bush and pretty much adhere to our program. And also, you restore civil society by restoring government services and transferring political control to the Philippines. Now, what that means is the day-to-day affairs of actually running things or getting things done, that's the Filipinos. But the decisions about what's going to be done, that's going to be done by the American overlords. In 1900, a new American commander, General Arthur MacArthur, whom as I always say, his name proves that some parents hate their children. Arthur MacArthur was sent to the Philippines to establish order, and Arthur MacArthur, he had won the Medal of Honor in the Civil War, so he already came with a very, very good reputation for being a bold soldier, an energetic soldier, a courageous soldier. But he did not at all shy away from imprisoning the Filipinos, using deportation, executions, and the confiscation and destruction of Filipino property to punish the guerrillas, punish those civilians that were helping the guerrillas. In other words, he did all those: imprisonment, deportation, execution, confiscation of properties. When you confiscate the property and the animals of a poor people, you are harming them economically in immeasurable ways. All of this to basically make it impossible for them to survive and bring them to heel. You may have already figured out that Arthur MacArthur was the father of General Douglas MacArthur, the general of World War II, the one who has that very famous photograph of him wading ashore in 1944 after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when he announces to the Filipino people, "I have returned." So the Philippines, as a reality in the life of this MacArthur family, has some long longevity. In 1902, Secretary of State Elihu Root said, "It is evident that the insurrection has been brought to an end, both by making a war distressing and hopeless on the one hand, and by making peace attractive." You make war distressing on the one hand and make it so horrible, peace under any conditions will look good. In the spring of 1902, the last major offensive was undertaken by revolutionary military commanders, and they surrendered. And on July 4th, Independence Day 1902, the United States proclaimed their insurrection over. So in that very brief period from 1899 to 1902, 126,000 regular and voluntary US soldiers served in the Philippines. 1,000 died in battle or of wounds received in battle. 3,000 more died because of disease and other causes, and nearly another 3,000 were wounded. But like so many things in life, there were consequences. And those consequences were as follows. First, in the tradition of be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it, the Americans wanted to follow, or at least wanted to compete with the Europeans as a colonizing power. We also wanted to have an overseas empire, like the British and the French and the Germans did in Africa and in Asia and in the Caribbean and elsewhere around the world. Now that we joined that club, there are benefits to it, but as you can see here, American acquisitions from 1857 to 1904 meant that we had Alaska, Midway, the Hawaiian Islands, Palmyra, Jarvis, American Samoa, all these areas, which makes for a nice arrangement if you're going to deploy to the oceans that massive battle fleet that had been theorized by Alfred Thayer Mahan. But what it also means is that you also are knocking on the doorstep of another rising Pacific power called Japan. And it was because of the competition in the Pacific in the early 20th century that American military planners at the War Department were moved to ask themselves the question, what will ever happen if the Americans and the Japanese go to war? Nobody thought that we would, because in 1904 and 1905, the Japanese are going to blow the Russian fleet out of the water at the Battle of Tsushima Straits, which is going to definitely prove that the Japanese are not just another naval power, they are a contender naval power. In the aftermath of that, that question was asked. And because the Japanese we were on pretty good terms with them, aside from the harassment that Japanese immigrants were getting in California, the relations between the two countries were not all that bad. But what it came out as a result, in response to that question, American military planners developed something called Plan Orange. Plan Orange was the war plan that we would follow in the event of war with Japan. 37 years after 1904, on December 7, 1941, people at the War Department went to their files, dusted off, blew the dust off that war plan called Plan Orange, and for the initial stages of World War II, that was the plan that we used in the Pacific War against the Japanese. And it was a very brutal war. Second point, there's absolutely no getting around the fact of the superior, paternalistic, and even racist foreign policy of the United States during this period. But America wasn't alone. The Europeans did it, the French did it, and as I mentioned to you all, the Belgians were the worst of all of them. But these trends and traditions that were established in the early part of the 20th century, right now as I speak to you, the animosity, the hostility, the legacy of being treated like this, we are continuing to deal with some nations around the world as a result of this policy in the early 20th century. And then this. Leadership has consequences. William McKinley, by many standards, was a pretty decent president. But like a lot of American leaders, a president is a very powerful individual, but they're not all powerful. William McKinley depended upon people that gave him intelligence. He depended upon advisors, and the ultimate decision was one that he had to make. He made some mistakes. He had some misgivings about getting involved in the Philippines. He had some misgivings before he went to war with Spain. McKinley was not one of these individuals who wanted to go to war with Spain. But like Woodrow Wilson, very much in World War I, who tried to keep us out of World War I, McKinley will find himself confronting a growing sentiment in the country that says we got to do something to help the poor Cuban people. We can't just stand on the side and watch them being brutalized like this. So for a whole range of reasons, McKinley, an otherwise good president, will make the decision to get involved in the Spanish-American War. Now we know we have seen different qualities of leadership. Abraham Lincoln has a memorial built to him in Washington, D.C. It's very hard, I think, to find somebody that would say Abraham Lincoln was not a great leader. Hated in his time, thought incompetent, thought not up to the task, thought a lightweight. And then there's the quality of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, in his time, people dismissed him, didn't think he could do it. But it turns out that he was the right man at the right time to be the last president to bring the Soviet Union, or at least to put the Soviet Union on the path toward ultimate destruction. So the legacy of the Filipino War and the competition that would eventually happen with Japan. Second, the legacy of the way people felt about how they were treated by the United States and how we're still dealing with that. And lastly, leadership has consequences. I'll take your questions and your comments.
I've got a comment. My mother's parents, with a missionary attitude, went to the Philippines and taught in U.S. government schools. The language was English in the schools. My mother and her brothers picked up the Tagalog or whatever the native language was, and my grandparents refused, said, "You cannot speak their language," for one of two reasons. It was inferior, or another thing was, if the brothers and my mom talked to each other, they wouldn't know what they're talking about.
Right.
But anyway, it was a very suppressing of the Philippine culture in these American schools.
Right. That's spot on, John. I learned, I was a kid, so I was picking up languages very easily anyway. But by the time my father was stationed in the Philippines, early 1960s, I guess, that attitude, that mindset had dissipated. And, here's the amazing thing. The amazing thing that used to, it still amazes me, even when I was a child, was that I could be romanticizing it through selective memory, but I remember that in the Philippines, if you were an American, particularly an American service person, you basically couldn't do any wrong. The Filipinos were so grateful about what the Americans had done in helping to fight the Japanese during World War II, because the Japanese were just so horrifically brutal and mean and horrible. The Japanese, among other things, the whole thing with the comfort women, reducing other Asian women, the Koreans, the Vietnamese, the Thais, the Filipinos, to sexual slavery. And so when MacArthur left in the spring of 1942, and he said, "I shall return," then about a year and a half, 2 years later, he goes strolling up on, he goes wading ashore and announces to the Filipino people, "I have returned." There was great celebration about that. So even during the Vietnam War, there was a great relationship with the Filipino people, but there are also many people that also still remembered the Philippine occupation and that legacy that you're talking about, John. They remember that as well. Other questions or comments? It was that good, huh?
So, question, Fred.
Yes.
Looking at, can't forget the parallel between the Philippines of 1900 and Vietnam.
Right.
And when I think about War College, and I think about all those professors that teach about previous wars, didn't they learn anything in 1900 that they must have not used in terms of a playbook for Vietnam?
I don't know. I don't know the curriculum of what they're teaching at the War College, but to get into your question, Gary, the evidence was there. Look at all the different parallels you have between Vietnam and the Philippine insurrection or the Philippine American War. And let me again make the point. It's very dangerous or very, it's a slippery game to take an event that happens here and then say 50, 60 years later, if we had just paid attention the first time. Okay, I get that, because by that time, from 1902 to 1965, we fought 2 world wars. We've got nuclear power. We're about to put men on the moon. Clearly the world is changed, it's different. That being said, it doesn't mean that there were not things to learn. And so what you've got in Vietnam, American forces, thousands of miles away from home, fighting a war that basically was a nationalist struggle to have an independent country. Check box 1. Same thing with the Philippines. 2, American political leaders who began to have doubts about the enterprise. Check box 2. 3, an opposing force that knows it can't beat the wealth and might and the numbers of the United States. So they're not going to try to outdo us materially. They simply just want to wear us down. Another similarity. Now, in the case of the Filipinos, and this is why making these one-to-one comparisons are not perfect. In the case of the Filipinos, they didn't wear us down. In Vietnam, they absolutely wore us down. But also, there was a growing anti-war movement inside the United States during the insurrection and also during Vietnam. And the kind of pacification attempts in the Philippines to build roads, schools, bridges, check that box, because they did the same thing in Vietnam with what they call pacification programs. And the fact that the Filipinos resorted to guerrilla warfare, and in Vietnam, they resorted to guerrilla warfare. So there's enough evidence there, Gary, that you may not be able to say that one situation is exactly like the other one, but there's enough evidence there to give you some idea about how you might choose to fight the next war differently if it begins to show those same parallels.
Thank you.
Sure.
You've opened up my eyes to so much of what led to the way we are today. Let's hope we can learn from some of this.
Let us hope so. It's out there. The lessons are out there to be had. We just have to know and pay attention. Well, pay attention and supply those lessons. Others.
Well, just to kind of piggyback on that, you know, we have so much that is left out of our history books or whitewashed, pun intended. You know, it's just kind of a sad commentary that here we are at this age and we're for the first time examining what we did to get those territories, because we did some brutal things here, you know, in the Philippines and Hawaii, but if it gets addressed in the history book, it's all kind of a propaganda, kind of a focus of how great America is.
Yeah, and you know what, Pat, you're right. And you know, one of the things that I was taught in grad school was to not make the mistake of taking, you know, let's say, for example, 21st century values, culture, sensitivities, and overlaying it onto, let's say, what happened in the 18th century, you know, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Right, so on the one hand, I think that there were people in 1899 who said that what was going on was brutal as far as colonization goes. People agree with that today. That's a happy, one-to-one connection. But when you look at a thing called, you know, you start getting into things like antebellum slavery, oh, they shouldn't have had slaves. I agree they shouldn't have. But as an historian, I had to look at how life was from the perspective of people on the ground then, in order to understand it then, the culture that made it okay then. And then what I find out happily is that there were people back then in that same time period who also found slavery or colonization or women not having to vote as equally troubling and problematic as people would today. So it turns out that there were people back then, maybe not in the larger numbers, but there were enough to help us understand that even in those societies, there were people that opposed those injustices. And so what that tells us is to not be so simplistic in approaching them, that things were a lot more complex. And if we're going to understand the complexities then, what that should tell us is that we should be very careful about putting things into binary situations today. Up, down, left, right, black, white, right, wrong. It is far more complex than that.
Fred, can I ask a question? This is Rick Byrne. For the group, in 1969, I was the dispersing officer and what was called the wardroom officer on the USS Columbus. This is a guided missile cruiser. I believe everybody on this call was alive in 1969. Probably Susan, you were might not have been, but she was there too. Okay. So in 1969, I am managing the cleaning of the officers' staterooms. I am managing the officers' food. Does anybody have any idea in the S6 division what exclusive nationality was in the division?
Filipino.
You got it. Fred is a brilliant man. We had no blacks, no whites. It was extreme. And this is 1969 United States Navy. These guys did quite a thing, though. They came over, they would spend 2 years, go back home for 60 days, spend 2 years in the US. They'd go home at age 38 and be the equivalent today of multimillionaires and relax the rest of their life. But a terrible life from 18 to 38.
That's right.
Just to comment, as late as 1969, we had this Filipino game going on.
And do you know one of the largest today? One of the Philippines' largest exports. You know what that is? Domestic workers around the world. Domestic workers around the world. You know, the Philippines have a ton of economic problems, and certainly they have a ton of problems right now with this guy. Well, in my opinion, this guy Duterte, they voted him to be president, but what they've got basically is, he's waging war on drugs, so I guess that's what they want. But your comment is interesting because, Rick, because before the Filipinos were relegated to doing that job, it was in the Navy, only black people could do that job. From the Civil War all the way until probably the end of World War II. Most of those jobs of the messmen, taking care of the captain's quarters, that was primarily the purview of the category of the African Americans on board naval vessels of war. That's what they were slotted into doing. Yeah. But you're right, in 1969, it would have been Filipino messmen. Others, you all look so good.
Fred, I'm going to diverge a little. Do you want to comment on whether you're going to have a class in the fall?
Yes, we're going to have one in the fall. We're going to be doing a four-part series on World War I. There's been some discussion about whether or not we'll be able to use the classroom and maybe do, I don't know how many people will be in that classroom, but let me tell you, if they let me inside of a classroom, if they say yes, I'll be there. Because while this is okay, it kind of sucks. So I want to be there face to face with you all, and this is working okay. But I want to be there with you all so we can get at these subjects, and it depends upon where we are by then, the quality of our leadership by then, and what the policies are on social distancing and so forth, and frankly how much progress we made in the battle against this virus. You know what? We cannot, as I said at the start of the program, the start of the presentation, I've been telling my sons that it's because we're going through this every day and you can't see what's going on, but 25 years from now, we look back at this, we'll be able to notice major changes taking place. Our world is being reshaped right now as we speak. This is changing the way we do work. It's changing the way we're doing education. It's changing the way we relate to each other. I haven't talked to my sister this much in years. So finally I told her, look, I'm tired of looking at you. Just go back to the voice-to-voice phone call.
I just have to say, so you may or may not know, but Kim and I have been blessed to be able to be in the office. The office is closed, but a couple days a week. And when Kim got off the phone call with Dr. Johnson the other day with a confirmation that you were going to be teaching a number of classes, she gave a visible yes. So I know your contributions are very appreciated, and all the feedback, and including some chats that have come through, have been very favorable. I'm going to go ahead and just announce that it is 11:03 and we're wrapping up. As I had said earlier, Dr. Johnson is gracious with his time and said he'd answer a few more questions. So if you have anything else that you want to talk as people start dropping off, please do so, and we'll probably wrap in about 5 minutes. So thank you, everybody.
Brad,
Yes.
hear me? The winning of hearts and minds seems to be a project we're doing in Afghanistan right now. Didn't work for the British, didn't work for the Russians. You want to comment on our probability of success?
You know, I didn't. There's a quote that I've seen by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was one of the greatest conquerors of all time, and there's a proverb attributed to him where it says, you know, protect me from this, protect me from that, but most of all, protect me from the wrath of the Afghan. That's Alexander the Great. The Afghan people have proven, and you're right, the British, the Russians, and let's face it, the Russians threw the full force of their military might at the Afghan people. Now, true enough, they had us supplying Stinger weapons, and we were undermining the Soviet Union. That's what we were supposed to do as their enemy or as their international opponent. But if you got the full weight of the Soviet Air Force, Army, and Special Forces at you, and you can't defeat a people who are basically still very much tied to their old world ways, that says something about the Afghan people. They have been in a state of constant warfare, not for decades, but centuries. So I don't know how many of the hearts and minds, not to mention, there's this part. Even after all this time being in Afghanistan, we still don't know that area. We still don't know those people. Again, it's an echo of Vietnam. We didn't know who the people were, their culture, their language, the struggles that they'd had, their value systems, and the fact that, especially in Vietnam, the fact that they were fighting a civil war and ultimately a nationalist war. And you have in Afghanistan, Waziristan, you have all those other areas, the former Soviet republics, you have people who are speaking Pashtun and other languages, and you simply just you can't come from a Western viewpoint and just parachute into the middle of that and think you're going to get a lock on the situation. You can build schools, bridges and whatnot, they'll appreciate that, but whether or not you get inside their hearts and minds, which is the premise of your question, I don't know how effective that is.
So Fred, talking about wars, and when we bring the full force of the military to another country like Vietnam or the Philippines, and you've been to Vietnam recently, and
Yes.
I think that American forces are bringing American culture into that country that then really, again, historically changes that country going forward.
That's
And
right.
I think you probably saw the results of that when you visited there with students. And I'm questioning whether the Vietnamese population saw that as a positive change to their culture or a negative change to their culture.
Well, let me say this, Gary. When I was in Hanoi, because see, you're more likely to see American culture in Ho Chi Minh City, once called Saigon, because South Vietnam was where most of the Americans were, right? An American military presence there for 10, 15 years. You expect the American culture to be there because the American military brought with it some significant economic advantages because soldiers get paid to go out and spend money and do stuff. So that was good for Vietnam. But the first time I went to Vietnam at 27 with the students, when we were in Hanoi, when I saw a Kentucky Fried Chicken in Hanoi, I said, okay, we won. But the other part about just exactly how much of that. So you can, yeah, if you have that kind of American capitalism, which is infiltrating even the North or even President of the North, fine, that says something about how America is a better partner in peacetime than it was during wartime. But whether or not we still understand the Vietnamese people, I think that we're definitely cooperating a lot more. And you're finding a lot, one of the most wonderful things about what's happening in Vietnam right now, in my estimation, between American and Vietnamese relations, you find American service personnel who are returning to Vietnam to help do things like remove unexploded bombs, find unexploded mines. We were told by our senior Vietnamese representative that there's an American B-52 pilot who was participating in Operation Linebacker 1 and 2 in December 1972. Now, some of you all will recall, most of you all will recall, that in December 1972, President Nixon got very frustrated because the Vietnamese delegation in Paris got up and walked away from the negotiating table. So he basically just sent flights of B-52s to bomb the daylights out of North Vietnam. And our senior representative that we work with over there, he lived through that Christmas bombing. And it eventually brought the Vietnamese back to the negotiating tables. So even though I think one of Nixon's aides said that he was having a temper tantrum internationally, it achieved the result. But one of the pilots who flew during that period, he's back in Vietnam right now. We're told that he came back like a lot of veterans. You know, he was affected by the war. His marriage tanked. His kid had trouble getting along with his kids. He went back over there, and now he's helping them remove unexploded ordnance from around the country. That's going on. There are American servicemen who returned to Vietnam just to see where they fought and establish good relations with people. So while our foreign policy officially these days is going all over the place, there's a thing called public diplomacy where individual American citizens, as soon as we're allowed to fly to other countries again, they're establishing relationships with people on the ground that are generating a lot of goodwill. I'm telling you, the 3 times I've been to Vietnam, we have been treated with nothing but respect and honor and dignity. And I think I share with a lot of you all, particularly when we went to the survivor of the My Lai massacre, there was no way that guy should have been as kind and generous to us as he was. He saw an American soldier kill his mother less than 50 yards from where he was hiding. He welcomed us like we were a long lost family. So there's a lot to be cultivated and gathered from good relations with the Vietnamese people and using that as an example of other nations around the world. You know, they say in diplomacy that if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Sometimes there's a place for soft power. And things like programs and aid programs and education programs, you know what? They're a lot cheaper than bullets, and they're a lot less destructive than losing American young people's lives.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You know, you talked about Africa, and that's exactly what the Chinese are doing in Africa.
Oh, yeah.
They're going in and, you know, digging wells and doing infrastructure, and that's, which is a lot less costly, and, you know, right off the bat has people looking forward to their presence.
Yeah. And, you know, the United States has gotten a lot better, or we've gotten better at our relationship with the African continent, nations on that continent. But the problem is that it took until the 21st century to establish something called Africa Command. Now I think Africa Command is in Stuttgart, West Germany, or Stuttgart, Germany. So that's good. But in a day where you're concerned about international terrorism, we have to ask ourselves some questions. Can you really afford to not be involved deeply in Nigeria when they have Boko Haram, which found common cause, which identifies with ISIS? You know, you have Egypt, Somalia, and Libya, or Egypt and Somalia, which are more, they identify more with Arabic, Middle Eastern countries than they do with nations on the African continent. You got Morocco in the northern part of the country, which is a moderate Arab nation, but people have been worried about it being radicalized. Tunisia was a nation in northern Africa where the thing that they call the Arab Spring started in 2011 and then moved east. With regard to Libya, as bad as it was under Muammar Gaddafi, you know, if there's anything that one can say about Gaddafi, is that he was a terrible leader. He was, you know, full of atrocities, but you at least knew who the government was. There's no idea who that is these days. Competing elements. In the central part of the continent, in the Congo, there are warlords running amok, and there's still a whole lot of work to be redone on establishing peace and eliminating the lingering hostilities and legacy of apartheid in South Africa. America has a grand opportunity to get involved in all of that stuff and cultivate some good relationships. But again, we're looking elsewhere, and I don't know, quite frankly, what the state of the State Department is right now, but the last time I looked at this, our foreign policy still had a lot of improvement to do on the African continent. And particularly when it comes to things like the expansion of the Sahara Desert, which involves a discussion of climate. That's another day, though.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I think this would be a good place to stop.
Before we go, I told y'all before, I miss you. Look forward to seeing you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Everybody have a great rest of your week and weekend.